Just a moment. I guess you got to talk into this mic. Can everyone hear me all right? Welcome. I'm glad you're here. My name's Scott Henderson, and I'm one of the coordinators of this event, and we've been working hard to put this together, and it's finally here. I want to thank a number of people for all the efforts that were made to put this together. I want to thank Grace Baptist Church for hosting it, and the Ladies of Grace for baking cookies. I hope you're enjoying those cookies, and it looks like, it looks like there's plenty, so eat up. I also want to thank the girls from Grits, from North Forsyth, for all that they've done to help as well. And I know I'm going to miss somebody, and I apologize, but it's just been a lot of planning involved in this. And I'm excited about it. I'm excited about our speaker, and I think you're going to enjoy this. So I'm not going to take much more of your time, but I do want to introduce my ministry partner in this event, Nick Peters, and he's going to come up, and he's going to introduce you to our speaker. So, Nick.
Hi, my name's Nick Peters. I run the website Deeper Waters, deeperwatersapologetics.com, and I host a podcast on iTunes, the Deeper Waters Podcast. And if you're looking for the best in Christian scholarship and apologetics in a podcast, that's the place to go. So how is it that I come to be the one introducing Mike at this event? Well, back in April of 2009, I was a student at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Mike Licona showed up to debate Bart Ehrman on this very topic tonight, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? Ehrman being one of the greatest skeptical New Testament scholars out there in the popular field and such. And I went up and spoke with him a little bit afterwards, and something you have to understand about me is I have Asperger's, which puts me on the autism spectrum, so sometimes I don't come across just the right way. He thought I was an atheist when he first saw me. And now, the story gets even better from here, because Gary Habermas, a few months later, told me that Mike has a daughter who also has Asperger's, and she's going through a very hard time, and she needs someone to talk to and such. Well, then, I started talking to her, and let's just say this atheist showed up at Mike's house 6 months later and said, "Hey, I'm here to date your daughter." Now, you might be wondering how that turned out at this point. 7 years. That's how it turned out. But Mike, over the years, I've come to know him more and more. We have several talks on various issues. We've done many things together. And I'll tell you something about Mike that you're not going to get from a lot of other people here is that I've never known Mike to toe the party line just to walk it. I've never known him to change his opinion on an issue just to win the favor of a crowd, even in many cases where it would be advantageous for him to do so. If he's convinced by the evidence, he will go with the evidence. And if that leads to negative consequences, well, it leads to negative consequences. But the truth is first and foremost in his mind. And he has done so much in-depth research on the resurrection of Jesus, wrestling with all of his doubts and such. And he's concluded, yes, Jesus did rise from the dead. That is the best explanation of the evidence. And today, he's going to share it with you. And this is the first time you're hearing this. I hope you soak it up. So I'm very pleased to introduce a great scholar, a great man, and one of two people I can say, welcome to the stage, Dad, Mike Licona.
Well, thanks, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you, Nick, for that, and thanks, Scott, for inviting me to be in this event. He introduced me a little bit. I'm going to back up a couple of decades before that then and give you a little more information about what led me to do what I'm doing. for a living. I grew up in Baltimore. It's a good place to be. Um, it's not a good place to live. And in fact, when I was growing up, I'm 56 years old. I'll tell you what, I'm going to use this mic right here. When I'm growing up in the 1960s and 70s, Baltimore and Washington, D.C. They were fighting every year to see which one would be the murder capital city of the U.S. So it wasn't a good place to grow up. I became a Christian at the age of 10. We had a Christian magician come into our church one Sunday, and he was doing all these illusions, but he was relating the gospel message to it. And before that, I just didn't know what it would take to be a Christian. My mom had told me, well, if you do more good than bad, then you'll go to heaven to be with God. But if you do more bad than good, then you'll go to hell and be with the devil forever. And I had a younger sister. I pulled her hair, I hit her, I made her cry, and I'm wondering, well, where am I on that scale? And when the magician came, he was talking about the gospel and saying, well, it's not a matter of what we have done, because it's the bad that we have done, no matter what we've done, even the smallest thing that keeps us from being the perfection that we need to get into heaven. And it's Christ who died for our sins. By putting our faith in him, we can have eternal life. By buying into his program and following him, we can have eternal life. And I thought, man, this is cool. Well, how do I do it? Well, it was a Presbyterian church, and he gave an invitation, which is weird for a Presbyterian church. And I remember age 10, it was a sunny, I think it was June afternoon, and I went up and two girls went up, Mary Lou Lyons and Sandy Moltz. I can't believe I even remember their names. And the three of us went forward and trusted Christ that day, and I'm thinking, well, why isn't everybody doing this? But I don't really care. I'm doing it because this is what I want. This is what I'd been wondering since about age 7 or 8, how do I get to heaven? And now I know it, and it's like, well, I settled things there with God, and it's like, that's pretty cool. Well, I grew only a little spiritually during my teens. I went to a public high school in Baltimore City, and then we moved out to the county, and so I was one of just a very few Christians in the school. And so I remember my senior year in high school, we had to do a senior project, and I decided for some reason I'm going to do it on the resurrection of Jesus. What's the evidence for the resurrection? I don't know how I came to choose that or why I chose it, but I just did. And so I did my senior project on that, and I remember turning in my paper, and I had to do a presentation. And all the fellow students were calling me Reverend Mike and Preacher Mike after that, and I hated that. But they did anyway. And then I got my paper back, and I'm excited about it, and I got a C on it. And my English teacher said, "You didn't prove anything." So anyway, I ended up going to Liberty University, a Christian university, and I was a music major. I played saxophone. I was planning on being a professional musician, playing jazz. And but my first year at school, I felt like God wanted me in the ministry, like he was calling me to some sort of ministry. I thought it was the music ministry. So I just grew and spent a lot of time in prayer and Bible study. And by the time I graduated as a senior, I was probably praying an hour to 2 hours a day and reading scriptures about an hour to 2 hours a day. And I know that's strange for a college student, but that's just where I was at. I was really hungry for the Lord at that point. Now, I wasn't a great student, though. I had never been a good student up to that point. I have a learning disability, ADD, which means attention deficit squirrel. And that's true. And I really found it hard to concentrate when I was in school. If I wasn't interested in it, and almost everything I was being taught, I wasn't interested in it, I could not concentrate. And so I got C's and C minuses and D's, all except in music stuff, like band and jazz band in high school. And then go to college, and I'm just getting C's, as a 2.0 GPA, so it wasn't that good. But my last semester in college, I had been getting into more in-depth Bible study, reading some commentaries and various translations to see what scholars had to say. And I'd read what the scholars were saying, and you'd hear good preachers come in, and they'd always talk about, well, what the Greek or the Hebrew says, Old Testament originally written in Hebrew, the New Testament written in Greek. It's like God starts out writing the Bible in Hebrew, and he says, you know what? I can do better than that. And so he starts writing the New Testament in Greek. And so I just loved Greek, and I decided, well, I want to learn Greek. And so I was a gifted student, and what I mean by that is when they gave me a C, it was a gift. So I took the Greek class, and I aced it. I just loved it. And so I went into the dean of the graduate school a couple of weeks before I graduated from college, and I said, hey, can I get it? I'd like to get into the Master of Arts in New Testament, and I'd like to specialize in Greek. And he said, well, what's your major? And I said, music. He said, you need to be a Bible major in order to get into that program. And he said, and how much Greek do you have? And I said, well, 1 semester. He said, you need 3. And he said, what's your GPA? And I said, well, it was 2.0. And he said, well, you need a minimum of 3.0 to get in. I'm just sorry. I thought, well, I really want to learn. And I mean, tell me, what do I need to do to get into the program? And he said, well, I'll tell you what. You go home over the summer and you take a year's worth of Greek through correspondence with Moody Bible Institute. And you come back and you take the Greek entrance exam, and if you pass it, we'll let you in on probation. And he thought he'd probably never see me again. Well, I went home that summer. After graduating from college, I had a full-time job, and I took a year's worth of Greek correspondence. Back then, they didn't have websites, you didn't have email, so they sent these audio cassette tapes, and I learned from that and took these tests and got an A in that. And I came back, and they told me I scored higher than anyone in the history of the school in my Greek entrance exam. So they let me in on probation, and I aced all my Greek classes. And I ended up doing okay. I had a 3.45 GPA, which is okay. And was really studying. I started reading the New Testament in Greek, and I just spending lots and lots of time doing that. And then one day I asked myself the question, is this stuff really true? And how would I know it's true? And see, I realized I'd been brought up in a Christian family, and Christianity was the only thing I'd been exposed to. And I got thinking, but if I'd been brought up in Afghanistan, maybe I'd be a Muslim. If I'd been brought up in India, maybe I'd be a Hindu. In China, an atheist. In California, a Democrat. So maybe the reason I'm a Christian is because I was raised a Christian. But what if I'm wrong? Why do I want to devote my life to a fairy tale? How do I know if Christianity is true? And so this really started to bother me, big time. And so I started to have doubts about my Christian faith, my last semester of graduate school. And so I was, one of my roommates said, well, why don't you go see Gary Habermas? He's a philosophy professor, and talk to him. So I did. And he pointed me to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And that's how I got initially interested in the resurrection. And so I started studying that. I finished grad school, at least my coursework, and back in 1985. And then I just started studying and looking at that and looking at all these different questions and looking at the scientific evidence for a designer, a creator of the universe and of life itself, and dealing with the difficult questions like, what about those who never heard? Is Jesus the only way? Why does God allow all the evil, pain, and suffering in the world? And doesn't that show that an all-good and all-powerful God doesn't exist? And what about all the other religions? And so these were the difficult questions, and I figured I'd start wrestling with these because I wanted to know truth. And I didn't want to, as Nick said, I've never been one to just say, okay, well, you said it and I'll believe it, you know. If this is something that possibly impacts my eternity, I want to know it, that it's true, not because you told me it's true. Because there are a lot of Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists who believe what they believe, and they will go to their deaths believing what they believe because that's the way they were raised to believe. So how do I know that what we believe is true? And other people like Mormons who come to your door, they'll say that the Holy Spirit has testified to them that Mormonism is true, the Book of Mormon's true, that Joseph Smith was a true prophet. You talk to others, they'll say that they know God has told them that their religion is true. Well, what do? We pick up the Bible, we're talking to a non-believer, and we say, here, start reading this. Maybe read the Gospel of John and pray and ask God and show you if it's true, and he will. What's the difference? So I figured the only way really to tell what is true here on the most important issue in life is to look to see if there's any evidence. Now, I ended up getting involved in a PhD program. I never thought I'd do that. When I went to Liberty University, I couldn't even spell MIT, much less get into a school like that. I was doing 20-page double-spaced papers with a few footnotes on it, and that was a nightmare for me. So I never thought I'd do a doctoral work. Well, I got involved in it, and I decided I was going to study the evidence for the resurrection as a historian, and I just became obsessed with it. I ended up, I just was reading and reading and reading, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to throw out some of this stuff publicly. I'm going to get involved in public debating, and never did anything like that before, hadn't been trained in it, and I'm going to get involved in it. And I'm going to debate some of these top guys out there. So I went against Bart Ehrman, as Nick said. He's probably the leading, most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in North America. I went against Shabir Ali, the leading Muslim debater in the world. Dale Martin, who's a senior New Testament professor at Yale University. Lane Pagels at Princeton University. All these different leading scholars out there, because I figured, they're smarter than I am. But I think I've got some really good arguments here, and I'm going to throw them out there, and if there's some weaknesses in it, they can point it out. And I would pray before those debates and say, Lord, if I'm wrong, I want to know. I genuinely want to know, and I realize I have blind spots. Everybody has blind spots, and I know I do, and I have my biases because I knew I wanted Christianity to be true. I want the resurrection to be confirmed. But if it didn't happen, I also want to know that. So God, even if you have to humiliate me, that's okay. Just reveal truth to me. And so I've had 26 of these debates. And the more I've done it, the more I'm convinced that Christianity is true. Because I don't think they've got any good arguments against it. Whereas in graduate school, writing a 20-page double-spaced paper was a nightmare for me with just a few footnotes. My doctoral dissertation ended up being like well over 500 pages, single-spaced, with over 2,000 footnotes. And finally, my doctoral supervisor said, Mike, you better shut things down here. Time to because the average doctoral dissertation is 60 to 80,000 words. Mine was around 255,000 words. I was just obsessed. I wanted to know truth, and I just kept digging. And so that's a little background about me and where I'm coming from. And I like to tackle the tough issues, and I want to get the truth. I don't want to settle for, like what Nick said, what the party line is, because the party line, in many cases, is wrong. And something as important as the eternal destiny of our souls, I want to know truth. Doesn't matter what it costs. So what I would like to do is I want to show you a little what I learned about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And since I've been doing this and debating and lecturing, and I teach theology, I teach New Testament at Houston Baptist University. I'm a theology professor there, and I travel all around the country, and I lecture a lot in different places of the world. We get to go to neat places and meet neat people. 2 weeks ago, my wife and I were in Israel, and we toured the Holy Land, and that was pretty cool. And then got back, and jet lag, it was like 6 hours difference there. They're 6 hours ahead. Got back, hopped in bed, and did some laundry. And next day, not even 24 hours later, I'm on a plane to Canada to do a conference up there last weekend. And then here we are, and then I'm going to Boston and Providence, Rhode Island on Tuesday for a week. So all kinds of neat things we get to do. Well, Palm Sunday, my old church up in Virginia Beach, where we lived for 14 years, Spring Branch Community Church, they invited me to come up to a seminar on the evidence for the resurrection and also to speak on Palm Sunday. So we did that. I did it on Saturday, and Palm Sunday I spoke, and then Palm Sunday night, the pastor, Michael Simone, and his wife, Gail, took us to dinner, my wife and I, to dinner at a really, really nice Italian restaurant. Perhaps the nicest one I've ever been in. And there we go. And there we were at dinner that night, and just wonderful food. Wonderful, wonderful food. I love Carrabba's. That's my favorite. But after Carrabba, this place is one up from Carrabba's. It was just amazing. So we're sitting there eating dinner, and as we're talking, the pastor, Michael, he leans forward and he says to Debbie and I, "Did you guys ever watch the television series Lost?" And we said, "Yeah." "Did you like it?" "Oh, we loved it. We didn't see it when it was on. We waited till all the seasons were over, and then we did a Netflix marathon." How many of you watch Lost? You like it? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? So he said, "Do you remember the guy, John Locke, who had the bald head, kind of, muscular guy?" And said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, his name is Terry O'Quinn." I think it's Terry O'Quinn. "And he lives here in the Virginia Beach area." And he leaned forward a little further, and he says, "Now, don't turn around, but he's sitting in the booth right behind you." Oh, that's pretty cool. Well, to make a long story short, within the next 2 minutes, I got my picture taken with him. So, So we do get to meet some neat people along the way and do some neat things. Well, all right, so let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus. Did Jesus rise from the dead? All right, I'll give you some evidence here. Why is it important? Well, let me give you a few reasons. One reason is because Jesus predicted his resurrection. So his critics would come to him and say, "How do you know, or how can we know that what you're claiming about yourself, about being God's uniquely divine son, how do we know if that's true?" And he says, he predicts his resurrection. Kill me, and in 3 days I'll rise from the dead. So if he didn't rise from the dead, that makes him a false prophet. And nobody should worship him, right? And the Apostle Paul, one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest writer in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians, a book written probably 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death, some of the Corinthians are writing to Paul and asking him questions about the afterlife and about the resurrection. And there were people telling them that there is no life after death, that when you die, that's it. And so they're saying, "Well, what about this, Paul?" And Paul says, "Look, if we're not going to be raised, then that means Christ was not raised." Why? Because we're part of the general resurrection, and Jesus was the beginning of that general resurrection. So if there is no general resurrection and we're not going to be raised, then that means Jesus was not raised. And if Jesus was not raised, then our faith is worthless. It means he was a false prophet, he was a failed Messiah. We are still in our sins, accountable before God, and those who have died, our loved ones and friends who have died as Christians, are forever lost. We're never going to see him again. And then he goes on in the same chapter, he says, "Look, if I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." So what Paul's saying, I and all the other apostles are out, we're risking our lives, we're suffering great persecution, we're under the threat of death every day. Why should I fight the wild beast in Ephesus and go through all this if this life is all there is? If this life is all there is, and there's no afterlife, then let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Party today, get all the ice cream you want, get all the sex that you want today, get all the weed that you want today. Go out and enjoy yourself as much as you want, because tomorrow we die. There is no one to be accountable to. There is nothing to fear about that. Eat and drink and be merry. And I think Paul's right. My wife has said to me at times, "Well, Mike, you know what? Even if Christianity wasn't true, I think it's best and would be happiest if we still live by Jesus' rules." I said, "The heck with that. Forget it. Forget it." Yeah, you like that, huh? I'm going to eat and drink. For tomorrow we die. I'm going to go out and I'm going to enjoy life to the max. So this is the importance of the resurrection. Why shouldn't we eat and drink, for tomorrow we die? When you all who are in high school and in college, and you're under all these different kind of temptations for sex, We're under all these kind of temptations for sex, for drugs, all these kinds of things. Why not do that? Why not do that? If Christianity isn't true, if Christ was not raised, why should we try to live a holy life? But when you're under temptation, if Jesus did rise from the dead and you know he rose from the dead, then that's a reason to live a holy life. Because not only is it in your benefit to do so, it's also within your benefit because we're accountable to God for our actions. So when we are tempted, we need to know whether our faith is true. And there comes a day in this country, which probably will, when Christians are persecuted. I mean, really persecuted. And it may happen within our lifetimes. Why should we suffer, allow ourselves to suffer, if Christianity isn't true, and suffer for a false religion? So this is really important what we're talking about here. So, I've written over a 700-page book on this topic, and I can't cover it all, but I just want to cover maybe something that's just really simple evidence for you. So simple that even a Southern Baptist can understand. I worked for the North American Mission Board, Southern Baptist Convention for 6 years, so I get to make those kinds of jokes. I'm going to just talk about our finest source, historical source for the resurrection of Jesus, okay? Now, maybe you're thinking it's the Gospels, and the Gospels are a great source. This is my current research project. I've been lecturing on the Gospels for several years. I debated Bart Ehrman last year, written debate on are the Gospels historically reliable, and I'll be debating him at Kennesaw State University on February 21st on that topic. So if any of you want to come to that, it'll be a live debate. It's no cost for it, and you can see what these debates are like. So we'll be debating on the historical reliability of the Gospels. He says they're not historically reliable. I say that there are, and we each will provide reasons for what we believe there. Ehrman gives a number of reasons why he says the Gospels are not historically reliable. He says we don't know who wrote them, despite the fact that our New Testaments have titles. The authors were biased. The Gospels contain all kinds of contradictions. They were written too long after the events they purport to describe, and they're not written by eyewitnesses. And these are his 5 major objections against them. Well, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, that's irrelevant. I'll tell Bart, you are wrong on all 5 accounts, but it's irrelevant for the resurrection. But if you're interested, I do have a lecture online, the ABCs, D's, and E's of defending the Gospels. And it stands for all 5 of those: authorship, bias, contradictions, dating, and eyewitnesses. And you can see how I respond to those. All right. Well, let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus. I'll tell you what, I'm going to skip this right here. Okay. What's our best source? It's Paul. Paul's even better than the Gospels from a historian's viewpoint. The Gospels are really good, but Paul's even better. He's our ace. And why is he so good? Well, because he was not a Christian at the time. He claims to have seen the risen Jesus. In fact, he was quite biased, but he was biased in the other direction. He was arresting Christians. He was throwing them into prison and consenting to their execution for being Christians. And then he became one when he had an experience he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, what I just said to you right now is agreed upon by virtually 100% of all scholars out there, including skeptical ones. And I'm not talking about skeptical ones outside the field, someone like a Richard Dawkins, a militant atheist who's a scientist, but he has no training in history, and so he's just a layperson when it comes to that. He's as unqualified to speak about history as I am unqualified to speak about science. There's a handful of scholars in the world today who say Jesus never existed. The major proponent is Richard Carrier. He's a legitimate scholar, but by his own count, when he includes himself, there are only 7 scholars in the world who say Jesus never existed. There are more scholars who deny the Holocaust. So while some of these, it's popular on the internet to say Jesus never existed, it is not popular among scholars. Scholars laugh at people who deny the existence of Jesus Just like contestants or the judges look at many of the early contestants on American Idol who get up there and they think they're really talented and great, but the judges are just going, oh. And that's what historians and scholars think about those who deny the existence of Jesus. The evidence is just too good for the existence of Jesus. So the facts that I'm giving you here are facts that are granted by virtually 100% of all scholars who study the subject, including atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, liberal Christians, you name it. Paul says that 3 years after his conversion experience, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle, and spent 15 days with him, and he also saw James, the brother of Jesus. And then he says 14 years later, he returned to Jerusalem to meet with the pillars of the church, and he names them, Peter, James, and John. So second time meeting Peter, second time meeting James, and now he's meeting John. You got the Peter, Paul, James, and John, the Fab Four, talking theology, talking Jesus. Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't you have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that? Even Bart Ehrman, the famous skeptic, said, I'd like to have been there. I'd really like to have heard what they talked about. I mean, really, that would be awesome. I'd give everything I owned right now to have been in that room and hear what they say. It'd be awesome. So when he went back up 14 years later, and now we're talking around the year 49, Galatians is written in either 49 or 55, but he's talking about the year 49. He goes up to Jerusalem, meets with Peter, James, and John, and he's running the gospel message past them. I want you to remember that, the gospel message, that the same gospel message that he had been preaching, because he wanted to make sure he was preaching what they were preaching. And Paul said, they added nothing to what I said. They extended the right hand of fellowship. In other words, you're good, Paul, fist bump. Keep up the good work, brother. So Paul's saying that the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John, those who had known Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter and John, two of Jesus' three closest disciples, that they confirmed, certified that he was preaching the same gospel message they were preaching. So you know what's really cool about this? If we were to get the gospel message, what that gospel message was that Paul was preaching, then we would know what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching apart from the Gospels. And it's earlier. Paul's writing before any of the Gospels were written. Now you say, well, as a historian, I look and I say, well, maybe Paul was lying. How do we know he was telling the truth? And that would be a fair question. So as historians, we look for corroborating data. And we have it with this. So for example, what's going on with this? Where's the feedback coming from? Yeah.
So when you pull it too far from your mouth, they have to raise the gain.
Oh, okay.
Try the other one back, maybe?
Now I'll just keep it close. So a guy named Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. I want you to remember some of these names because some of you young ones here, you're going to get married someday, you're going to have kids, and you're going to be looking for names. So just remember Polycarp. Okay. And Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. And he's writing decades after Paul's death. And he says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. That's pretty good. He also quotes from Paul's letters and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. And then you've got a guy named Clement of Rome. And he was a disciple of the Apostle Peter. And Clement calls Paul the Blessed Paul and places him on par with his mentor Peter. Now, these kinds of things are not the kinds of things that you would expect disciples of Peter and John to do if Paul had been preaching heresy. But it's precisely the kind of things you'd expect Paul to do, or them to do, if Paul was telling the truth when he said he was preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. I could go on, I could give you some more evidence, but that should suffice to show that when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, not saying on everything, but at least what we can confirm historically is that when we hear Paul on the gospel message, we are likewise hearing what the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, and John were preaching, those who had walked with Jesus. Now that would be historical gold if somewhere we had something where Paul gave the gospel message he was preaching. And what if we were archaeologists are digging around in Israel and they find some ancient papyri. And, we don't have all of Paul's letters. Some of them have been lost. So what's 1st and 2nd Corinthians in our New Testament is actually 3rd and 4th Corinthians. We're missing 1st and 3rd Corinthians. And Paul talks about a letter that he wrote to the church at Laodicea. What? Where's that? Wouldn't that be nice to have? So what if some archaeologists are digging around and they find Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the saints and faithful brethren in Christ who are in Laodicea. Wow. A lost letter of Paul. That'd be really cool. And they analyze it and they say, yep, we're looking at the grammar and the vocabulary, writing style. This is definitely Paul. And in that letter, Paul has some things in it like, hey, I understand that some of you were reading the copy of the letter that I sent to the church at Rome, and you were getting upset and having division and debates among yourselves of what I meant by predestination and election, and I'd like to clarify that for you. Wouldn't that be great? Then we would know for sure. Everybody would know that Calvinism is indeed false. So, what do you think about that, Scott? Huh? No comment? Okay. So, but what if that letter, Paul said in it, now I want to remind you the gospel message I preached to you. Well, and then he goes on and he's given that. That would be awesome. I mean, that's the kind of thing we'd be looking for as historians. Paul delineating what his gospel message was, because we know this is what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. Well, we don't need such a lost letter, because we have it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. And Paul says, now I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel message I preached to you. And now he's going to remind them of it. And he starts off at verse 3, and he says, I delivered to you what I also received. Now this is important, these terms delivered and received, because they were technical terms for the imparting of oral tradition. Because back then, only about 10% of the people could read, and maybe only half of them could write as well. So oral learning was how it was done. We don't do that in our Western culture. We don't do it at all. It's not like the game of telephone where I whisper something in your ear and you pass it to the person behind you, and by the time you get to the back, it's something totally different. I mean, that is something you play in kindergarten, where a teacher gives an unimportant sentence one time to children who quickly and playfully pass it along to one another in an uncontrolled manner. I had a kindergarten teacher come up to me in Indiana a couple years ago after I gave my lecture at a conference, and she said, I do that with my kids all the time. And they mess it up, and then I say, okay, we're going to do it again, and this time I'm going to give you a new sentence, and you must get it right, perfect, or there's no recess. And they get it right every time. Because that unimportant sentence becomes important then. Even though they only hear it once, they work at it. And 5-year-olds are able to do it. Now we're talking about, with the Jesus tradition, adults who lived under the brutal iron fist of Rome, where 1/3 of everybody living in the Roman Empire were slaves. And where more than 90% lived below the poverty level. Life was brutal. They wanted hope. They wanted to know there was justice from all the brutality and injustices going on. They wanted to know that the righteous would be rewarded and that the wicked would be punished. And there was a hope of eternal life. And Jesus gave that hope, and they preserved that message. And so there were these means of preserving that the ancients used to preserve oral tradition. It was not anything like we have today. And they were able to memorize volumes of information that would be unthinkable for us moderns, because we just don't do it. We don't need it. 20, 30 years ago, when I wanted to call someone, I either recalled their number from memory or I looked it up. Today, I just pick up my iPhone, I press Siri and tell her who to call, and she does it. Technology changes the way we live. So this is the imparting of oral tradition. Now let me show you what he delivered to the church that they also received. And Paul, he delivered to them in the year 51, when he established the First Baptist Church of Corinth. And he got this information in 49, or even before that. It was delivered to him by the Jerusalem apostles. We don't know exactly when, but it would have been no later than 49, and somewhere between his conversion around the year 32 and around 49, and he had this information. So he delivered it to them in the year 51, what he had received beforehand. We are way back, and we're getting close to not only the events itself, but we are right there with the eyewitnesses. And here's what that oral tradition. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. Now, I know that the font is small, but I wanted to squeeze this all in the same slide so you could see something. It's called parallelism. It was one of the devices that they would use to help you memorize things. So you can see it long, short, long, short. That's called parallelism. That gives it away also that it's oral tradition. They would do all kinds of things. They had chiasms and crea and parables and ways to help you remember things. Catch words like puns to help you remember. So you've got Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and that he appeared. And then Paul lists a number of the appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time. Paul says most of these remain alive, although some have died, meaning they're still around that can be cross-examined and can describe the experience. Then he appeared to James, the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles, and then Paul adds his own name to the list. There are 3 individual appearances here, Peter, James, and Paul, and 3 group appearances, to the 12, to more than 500, and to all the apostles. The group appearances are really interesting, and we'll get to those in a minute. Then Paul says, whether I or they, that is the other apostles, this is what we preached. And the word that he uses there for preach is in the Greek kerugma, for which we get the English term kerygma, meaning the official, formal, public proclamation. This is what they were preaching. This is what we preached, and this is what you believed. This is pretty cool. This is the gospel message. Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, his appearances to at least 3 individuals and to 3 groups. That's awesome. Now, who's missing from that list? Anybody want to tell me? Not you, Nick. Who's missing from this list? The women. Where are the women? In the first century, the view of women was very, very low. And by putting them on that list and mentioning it, it's going to count against them because nobody trusted women back then. So they just don't mention them. This is the official, formal, public proclamation. So rather than having to explain why they got women there, they just don't mention them. But the gospel authors mention them, even though it wouldn't have counted in their favor. Gospel authors report embarrassing things, like the discovery of the empty tomb by women, that Jesus first appeared to the women while the guys were hiding. Doesn't make the disciples look too good, does it? Makes the women look good. You don't want to do that in a patristic society, but the Gospels do it anyway because it's the truth. They report that none of Jesus' brothers believed in him during his ministry. It reports that Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Why would you do that? Why would you invent something like that and cast your church leader in such a negative light? You wouldn't invent something like that. The Gospels have all these embarrassing details. And I could go on and give you several more. But the Gospels have all these embarrassing details. You just would not make those things up. But for Paul's public proclamation, he's not going to mention the women. So he mentions 3 individual appearances and 3 group appearances. So here's what we get, minimum, undisputed, from Paul. Number 1, we know that he was hostile at the time of his conversion. By the way, again, all of these things here are agreed upon by virtually 100% of even skeptical scholars. That means they have a PhD and they are publishing in academic, peer-reviewed literature in the relevant field of New Testament studies or history. Virtually 100% of them agree that Paul was hostile at the time of his conversion. They all agree that he's very early as a source, that he claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus, that he knew Jesus' disciples, and that we can certify that he was proclaiming the same thing they were proclaiming. And that through Paul, 3 facts that we can know, minimal, is Jesus' disciples taught he was raised from the dead. Jesus' disciples taught he appeared to individuals, to groups, to friend and foe alike. And Jesus' and disciples intended for us to interpret the resurrection as an actual event. Because if Jesus was not raised, we're not going to be raised, and our faith is worthless. So these are things we can know with historical certainty apart from faith. You don't have to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible to get these. You don't have to believe that the Bible is God's word to get these. You don't have to believe that the Gospels are even trustworthy to get these. You can be an atheist and you still have to acknowledge these, because that's how good the evidence is. That's pretty cool stuff. What are the alternatives? Let's look at a few. Legend, myth that developed over time. Was the proclamation that Jesus was raised from the dead a legend or a myth that developed over time? No. Why? It's too early. The earliest Christians taught it. Now, urban legends definitely take place. But the disciples were the ones saying it. It's not a legend because it's going back to these original people who claim to be the eyewitnesses. We can trace it right back to them. So yes, urban legends do develop quickly. But that's not what's taking place here, because we can actually get back to the original people. What about deceit? The disciples were lying about this. How do we know that they weren't lying? They just said Jesus was raised from the dead and appeared to them, but it really didn't happen. All right, they lied about it. Well, that's not the case, because we know that all of them were willing to suffer continuously, and all were willing to die for their proclamation that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them. Liars make poor martyrs. Now, you say, well, wait a minute. Aren't there Muslim jihadists who are willing to just blow themselves up? It doesn't mean that Islam's true. Correct, I agree with you. But they're dying for jihad because they believe it's true, right? They don't go to whoever's telling them, to go blow themselves up. They don't go to them and the person says, all right, I want you to strap a bomb on your back and go do this, or I want you to jump in a truck and go mow over a bunch of people, and you're probably going to get shot and killed as a result of this. So, well, we want you to do this for jihad. Well, they don't jump in the truck and say, well, Muhammad's a false prophet, Islam is false, and if I kill these innocent people, I will probably go to hell. Sign me up. No, they're doing it because they believe it's true. Liars make poor martyrs. So when Muslim jihadists die today, they do it because they sincerely believe in their cause. When Christians are being beheaded by ISIS today, they are allowing it themselves to be killed because they believe Christianity's true. But modern day Christians and Muslims, for all they know, it could be false. They believe it's true, but they don't know that 100%. But it's different with the apostles, because they would have known that Jesus rose from the dead or that he didn't. And if he didn't rise from the dead, then they were lying, and then that means they were willing to die for something they knew was false. Now, you may be willing to die for what you believe is true, but are you willing to die a horrible death for something you know is false? That doesn't make any sense. Let's look at one more. Hallucinations. Now, this is the most popular alternate explanation out there given by scholars today. It was dead about 100 years ago, but it was revived about 20 years ago, and it's the most popular one today. It's to say that, the disciples were grief-stricken, right? They're grief-stricken, and so they, just like, anyone, they go out there and maybe they have grief hallucinations, maybe they turn to the bottle or some drugs. They had hallucinogenic mushrooms even back then. Maybe there was another reason they called Jesus the Most High God. Maybe these guys were on drugs and stuff. So maybe because of all the what was going on, they were grief-stricken and they started to have these hallucinations for one reason or another. Well, how do we know that's not the case? Number one, the percentage of percipients is too high. So in multiple studies about hallucinations that have been done over the last 100 years, what they have found is that the group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. Now, my mom died 4 years ago. My dad died 3 years ago. And a few months, 3, 4, 5 months after my mom died, my dad experienced a visual hallucination of my mom. And, but only 7% of senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. Only 7%. What does it say about he appeared to the 12? He appeared to all of the apostles. That's an unthinkable 100%. The medical research shows 7%. These reports say 100%. Doesn't seem like a hallucination. Here's another reason. Group hallucinations, you got to the 12, to more than 500, to all the apostles. 3 of them. 3 group appearances, but we know that group hallucinations are very unlikely, if not impossible. Before my family moved down here to Atlanta 14 years ago, 13 years ago, something, I don't know, back in December 2004, 13 years ago. We lived in Virginia Beach, and we got to know a number of the Navy SEALs because half the Navy SEALs live in Virginia Beach. A lot of them went to our church. And they would tell us about Hell Week. So one of the things you have to do to become a SEAL is you have to go through Hell Week. That's the beginning of your training. And you start Sunday night and you go all the way through Saturday around noon, but you only get to sleep 3 to 5 hours for the entire week. Not every night, the entire week. And due to sleep deprivation, they have all kinds of hallucinations. Most of them hallucinate when they're doing this exercise called Around the World. They're in this raft and they go out in the Pacific Ocean. They gotta go out there and circle this buoy and come back. And so they're working hard to doing that. Well, their minds start to rest and they haven't slept in a few days and they start to hallucinate. One Navy SEAL told me that when he was doing it, he thought he saw an octopus come out of the water and wave at him. Another guy said he thought he saw a train coming across the water. And he told the other guys about it, and they said, "You idiot, there's no trains out on the Pacific Ocean." But it was so vivid to him that he rolled out of the raft because he couldn't convince the others that the train was gonna hit him. And they had to back up and get him, pull him back in. One guy who's a lieutenant, he said he didn't experience any hallucinations, but he does remember that a number of, one guy in his raft was swinging his oar just wildly, and he said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm trying to hit these dolphins that keep jumping over our raft." And I said, "Did you see the dolphins?" "No." "Did anyone else?" "No, but they were having their own hallucinations." What you have to understand is hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. You are perceiving something that isn't really there. You're seeing something that's not there. You're smelling something that's not there. You're hearing something that isn't there. All right. All of us experience a hallucination of some sort. Remember when you got your smartphone for the first time and you put the text messages on silence, on vibrate, and you're sitting there and you thought you had one, and you picked it up and you looked at it? Nobody loves me. We all had those kind of things, right? Or what about, have you had a dream? That's called a tactile hallucination, by the way. And you notice you might have had that false hallucination there, that false sensory experience. But the person next to you didn't say, "Hey, you better check and see if you got that text. I heard it vibrate." You know, it's not contagious. It's not a group experience. Or you ever wake up because you had a sense of falling? That is called a kinesthetic hallucination. You don't have to be a flake to have a hallucination. All of us experience them at some time or another. All right? But group hallucinations, it just doesn't happen. It didn't happen with the SEALs. Hallucinations in some ways are like dreams. They're private occurrences that are going on in your mind. They have no external reality. So I could not wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, "Honey, I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation." You know, wouldn't that be nice? You can't do that because there's no external reality to it. You can't participate in the same dream. You can't participate in the same hallucination. And yet here we got a minimum of 3 group experiences. These weren't hallucinations. Here's another reason. Hallucination doesn't account for the appearance to Paul. Paul's not grieving over Jesus' death. Paul was glad Jesus was dead. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. And
yet Paul says he appeared to him. And haven't even mentioned the empty tomb, because not 100% of scholars agree that Jesus' tomb was empty. About 2/3 to 3/4 do, but we don't have that universal consensus on it, so I haven't mentioned it. But if Jesus' tomb was empty, that wouldn't explain the appearances. You'd have to posit how the tomb got empty, and then you'd have to posit, maybe theft and then hallucinations. But why would they hallucinate if the body was still in the tomb? So there's all kinds of problems with the hallucination hypothesis. At the end of the day, there's only one hypothesis that explains all the facts and does it well. That's the resurrection hypothesis. It explains why Jesus' disciples had experiences they were persuaded were appearances of the risen Jesus that occurred in individual and in group settings. It explains why even a persecutor of the church named Paul had an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him, and he converts to Christianity as a result. So at the end of the day, the resurrection hypothesis is the only hypothesis that can explain this. So what I would say is, if you're going to reject the resurrection hypothesis, you do so not for historical reasons, but either theological reasons. Maybe you're a Muslim or of a different belief, and you say, well, I don't know what to do with the historical evidence. I've been raised to believe something else. So you have theological reasons, or maybe philosophical reasons. You don't believe in God's existence. And you say, well, I don't know what happened there, but it couldn't have happened because I don't believe God exists. And in that case, I would just say, whether it's theological or philosophical, I'd say, well, the historical evidence is pointing to the resurrection of Jesus, and your worldview doesn't allow you to believe it. It may be time to change your worldview. Let's go with reality. Let's go with where the evidence points. What's really cool is I've debated 26 times some of the brightest minds out there. I don't think Christians have anything to be ashamed of. We've got the goods. We've got the evidence on our side. And, this is cool. And, again, if you're a college student, high school student, when you are being faced with these temptations, why should you remain holy? Why should you stand up for Christ? Because Christianity is true. And you can say, well, but if Christianity wasn't true, I'd have the benefit. I could do what I want. I can eat, drink, and be merry. Do whatever I want. Have all the ice cream, sex, and weed that I want. But if Christianity is true, you got God on your side. You want to get married someday? You ask God for a spouse. You ask him to lead you to that spouse. There's a big divorce rate. And let me tell you, I came from a divorced family. My mom and dad divorced. They split when I was 5, divorced when I was 7. I didn't want that to happen to me. My mom married a good guy, my stepdad, but he came from a divorce. So, marriage is tough. And so I got real serious when I went to college, and I said, I want the right wife, God. And I prayed every day. I prayed several times a day. I fasted. There were times I fasted for a week because I wanted God to lead me to the right woman, and he did. And it was great to know that I had God on my side, that I could pray and ask him for wisdom and guidance in some of these really important issues in life. And he can help you too. Maybe, look, we don't get to live and do some of the fun things and sin out there that a lot of those in the world like to do. It's a trade-off. We got God, though. And we have eternal life. And Jesus didn't say he'd make it easy. And the rich man came to him once and said, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you know the commandments. Don't kill, don't commit adultery. He says, well, I've already done these since youth. What do I lack? And Jesus felt compassion on him, and he knew he was a rich man. He says, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you sell everything you have, give to the poor, and come follow me? And the guy was really sad because he owned a lot. He walked away. And that's when Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter in heaven. It dawned on me about a year ago that it's interesting to see what Jesus did here and what he didn't do. What he did is he let the guy walk. He didn't call him back and say, whoa, wait a minute. Discipleship's a process. Just come on back here, kneel before me, pray this prayer to me, and get heaven solved and you can grow in your spirit. Nope, he let the guy walk. Jesus isn't just looking for someone who will say, just believe in me and go on with your life. He wants disciples. And at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, he says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is spacious that leads to destruction. It's easy to walk that path. It's spacious and it's wide. But the gate is narrow and the way is confining that leads to life. And there are few who find it. You want to be one of those few? You got to follow Jesus. Why should you follow him? Because he rose from the dead. And we've got evidence for it. All right, let me open it up for some questions. And I promise if you have some questions, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I promise not to embarrass you. If you want to push back on anything I've said tonight, feel free to do so, because we're all after truth. And I guess you're holding that mic, you're holding those mics for anyone who raises their hands. Is that right? So just raise your hands and they will bring a mic to you if you have a question.
How do you answer back when people say that your only source is Scripture, therefore it's not reliable?
Well, I would say you even have atheists and agnostics. One thing, you don't have to believe that the Bible is true to come to it and acknowledge that it's first century literature. It's like, hey, I don't believe the Quran is divinely inspired. I believe it's totally human, right? But I can still learn things from the Quran, such as when in the Quran, in one of the surahs, it says that Jesus spoke from the cradle and preached from the cradle. Well, I can know that Muslims back in the 7th century believed that Jesus spoke and preached from the cradle. Or when it says, lie in wait for the unbelievers, ambush and kill them, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, well, it sounds like Muslims were getting in fights and battles with non-Muslims and killing them, right? I don't have to believe it's God's word, the Quran, in order to conclude that historically. And it's the same thing. Historians come to the Bible, certain scriptures, and they're not acknowledging it, that it is divinely inspired or without any error. And they're just saying, what can we learn through this? At minimum, you can say, well, there were people in the 1st century who believed that there was a man named Jesus who died by crucifixion and rose from the dead, right? I mean, that's undisputed. And then you get a little more in depth and you say, okay, here's some letters that were written by Paul. Here's the evidence we have for that. Paul knew, and you look at other sources and say, oh, well, here's some people who knew the very apostles that Paul says he met with, and they're saying good things about Paul. And so you can establish a number of things historically from the Bible without acknowledging it that it's holy or from God in any sense. Now, I believe it's holy and from God, but I don't have to believe that in order to arrive at this. And that's the beauty of using historical method. I haven't relied on any of that, and I can quote atheists like Gert Ludemann and agnostics like Bart Ehrman and others who grant all these things because they come to the Bible and Paul's letters, and they said, well, we can know these things using historical method. And if they say, well, I still don't believe it because it's the Bible, I'd say, well, it's a free world. You can do whatever you want. But this is what even atheist and agnostic scholars do. If you want to be uber skeptical, be my guest. Deny the Holocaust too. I mean, you can, it's a free world. Well, you guys are, I must have left you speechless or something. Presbyterians have a whole lot more questions. I don't know. So it's 2-0 women here, so they're ahead of the guys.
You talked about these people wrote these books and they were willing to die, that they did see Jesus. Have you done any research like into the Book of Mormon and the men that say they saw those golden plates, did they get persecuted? Did they have to die over that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is dispute over that. Let me just give you the things that we can know, okay? So, I mean, there's some different stories of what happened, but there were those 11 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and by the end of their lives, 8 of them had left Mormonism, who said that they actually saw the plates. 8 had left. The only 3 that remained, their last name was Smith. They were related to Joseph Smith. So that's kind of interesting. Joseph Smith died. Now the Mormons will say that he died as a martyr. Well, not really. He was locked up in jail with some of his other followers, and people were coming up the steps. I mean, they were trying to kill them, and they started firing up the steps, and Joseph Smith and some others grabbed guns, and they were firing right back down at him. So, I mean, this is in church history. In other words, the volumes that are put out by Mormons called church history. It's the Mormon history of what happened. So whereas the Mormons who come to your front door, the 2 guys who are like 18, 19 years old, and they're called elders, they will say that Joseph Smith died as a martyr, just like a lamb, like Jesus did, you know. It wasn't a lamb. He had a 6-shooter in his hand firing at the enemies who were coming up at him. So, I mean, they died, but you can't say they necessarily died for what they believed was true. They got arrested for condoning the action of trashing a printing press, and they got thrown into prison for that. Now, no doubt some Mormons have been killed for their faith, but when we're talking about the founder and his original followers, we might not be able to say the same of them. Boy, women out showing the men tonight. All right, well, I got nothing else.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did and learned some things from it. I certainly do. Every time I hear Mike speak, I learn something new, and I get encouraged. My faith feels like it gets strengthened as a result of the experience, and I hope that's been the case for you, and that you recognize that we do have a firm foundation. It's not a bunch of myths and fairy tales, but it is historically based, and we can have confidence as a result of that. I don't know about you, but I'm not looking forward to my death, and the thing that gives me strength is to recognize that it's not permanent, and that if Jesus rose from the dead, then so will I, and so will you. And that's great news. So I want to ask our pastor of the church here, Randy Smith, if he would mind closing us out with a word of prayer. Would you do that, please, Randy?
Let's pray. Father, thank you for allowing us to come together, Mike coming to speak to us, and Lord, for all of these that have come to our church tonight to hear about the resurrection. And Lord, we pray that faith has been strengthened, and especially these young people, that their witness will be stronger, that they have the tools that they need to share with their friends and even those that do not believe about the resurrection and why we believe the way that we do. We love you and thank you for being our God and our Savior. In Jesus' name, amen.